Story 1: The Hospital Tunnels. They warned me about the tunnels when I first started working at St. Mary's Hospital. "Take the long way if you can," one of the older nurses said with a chuckle. "Unless you enjoy getting the life scared out of you." Everyone else joined in with knowing laughter. I figured it was just the usual banter. The kind of stories workers use to pass time during a long shift. But deep down, I wondered why no one ever denied the rumors outright. I didn't think much of it until that night. It was my first night of a 3-shift rotation. And the hospital was eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that feels unnatural. Like the silence is waiting to be broken by something wrong. By the time my break rolled around, I was feeling restless and decided to head to the sanctuary on the 5th floor. The quickest route was through the tunnels, a decision I regret to this day. When I swiped my key card and the heavy steel door groaned open, the air seemed colder, heavier than usual. The faint buzz of fluorescent lights flickering overhead only added to the unsettling atmosphere. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me with an echo that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. The tunnels beneath St. Mary's were infamous for their chilling reputation. Built during the hospital's expansion in the mid-1900s. They were originally designed to transport supplies and patients discreetly between departments. Over the years, as newer facilities were added, these underground pathways fell into disrepair. By the time I started working there, the tunnels were a strange mix of the functional and the forgotten. Some sections were still used for quick access between wings, but others were abandoned. Their decaying walls lined with discarded medical equipment and layers of dust that seemed untouched for decades. I'd walked these tunnels countless times, even alone, without incident. But that night, something was different. 2 minutes in, I noticed it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. At first, I dismissed it as another staff member heading the same way. But the steps didn't seem to follow any pattern, they were uneven, almost dragging. And they stopped every time I stopped. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing down the corridor. Nothing. I kept walking, quickening my pace. But the sound persisted. My pulse quickened, and my palms grew slick with sweat despite the chill in the air. Turning around again, I scanned the corridor. The flickering lights cast long, distorted shadows. But there was no one in sight. "Just your imagination," I told myself, forcing a nervous laugh. "You're just tired." But the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. In my growing unease, I missed the turn toward the elevators and found myself in a section of the tunnels I didn't recognize. The walls here were darker, the air heavier, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something metallic, like rust or blood. The corridor stretched endlessly, lined with relics of the hospital's past, rusted gurneys, splintered wheelchairs, and faded signs with peeling paint. I passed an old examination table, its leather straps cracked and frayed. It felt like I had wandered into a time capsule of forgotten horrors. As I tried to retrace my steps, a soft whisper brushed past my ears. "Leave." I froze. The voice was faint, almost inaudible, but it sent a chill racing down my spine. I spun around, but the corridor behind me was as empty as before. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pressed forward, desperate to find a familiar landmark. That's when the lights began to dim, one by one, plunging the tunnel into a suffocating darkness. I stumbled, clutching the cold wall for balance as my chest tightened with panic. The sound of footsteps returned. But now they were faster, heavier, Like someone, or something, was running toward me. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The air grew colder, and an oppressive silence fell. Then, out of the darkness, I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, darker than the surrounding gloom, shifting and twisting like smoke. But as it moved closer, it took shape, a tall, formless figure with glowing red eyes that burned like embers. My legs felt like lead, refusing to move as the shadow advanced. The eyes seemed to bore into me, radiating malice. A low, guttural growl echoed through the tunnel, reverberating in my chest. The figure lunged forward, and I felt a sharp, icy force slam into my arm, knocking me to the ground. Pain shot through my body as I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the cold, filthy wall. "Stay back!" I screamed, my voice barely more than a whisper. The shadow loomed over me, its eyes burning brighter. My vision blurred as panic consumed me. Just as the figure reached out, a beam of light cut through the darkness. A hand grabbed my arm and pulled me to my feet. It was the janitor, his flashlight casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. "What happened?" he asked, his voice firm but laced with fear. There's something back there," I stammered, struggling to catch my breath. "It had red eyes." He cut me off with a grave expression. "You saw it too?" His words sent a fresh wave of terror through me. "What do you mean? Two? What is it?" He didn't answer, just shook his head and muttered, "You shouldn't be down here alone." We hurried back to the main hospital, the oppressive silence of the tunnels weighing heavily on us. The janitor refused to speak further about what I had seen, leaving me with more questions than answers. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in those tunnels. Was it a ghost, a demon, or something beyond human comprehension? I've heard others share similar stories: whispers in the dark, phantom footsteps, and glowing red eyes. But no one knows for sure what lurks beneath St. Mary's Hospital. What do you think I saw that night? Was it my mind playing tricks on me? Or is there something truly sinister in those forgotten corridors? Let me know in the comments. One thing's for certain, I'll never set foot in those tunnels again. Would you? Story 2, The Care Home Apparitions. When I first started working the night shift at the care home, I thought the hardest part of the job would be staying awake. I imagined quiet hours spent reading files, occasional rounds to check on residents, and perhaps the odd creak of an old building settling into itself. But from the moment I began those midnight shifts, I realized how wrong I was. The care home wasn't just a place for the living. The first sign came with the footsteps, soft, deliberate, and always behind me. No matter how quickly I turned, I could never catch anyone there. Then there were the whispers, so faint I could almost convince myself I hadn't heard them. Almost. But the real terror began the night I saw her, the glowing woman with no face, her straggly hair spilling over her shoulders as she peeked out from the bathroom doorway. Her blank, smooth visage should have been expressionless, but I swear I felt her watching me. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just imagining things. This job wasn't about taking care of the elderly, it was about surviving the nights. Would you have stayed after seeing her? Before I dive into the rest of what happened, let me tell you a little about the care home. Built in the late 1800s, it originally served as a hospital during the war. Soldiers were treated here, and many never made it out alive. Decades later, it was converted into a facility for the elderly. But the building retained its grim aura. The residents had their own stories about the place. "You hear that whistling?" one man asked me once. "That's old Tommy. He used to whistle while he worked. They say. Died in the basement. Still hummin' a tune." Another resident claimed to see shadows moving across the hall when no one was there. "They don't mean no harm," she said with a raspy laugh. "They're just curious. Watching." But it wasn't until I started working nights that I understood just how deep the stories ran. It started small. On my very first night, I heard footsteps trailing me as I made my rounds. The halls were dimly lit, and every sound echoed unnervingly. I assumed it was another staff member and called out, "Is someone there?" No response. When I turned, the corridor was empty. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. But I shrugged it off. After all, old buildings creak and groan, don't they? But the phenomena didn't stop. A few nights later, as I passed the main hallway, I felt a light tap on my head, almost playful. I whipped around, expecting to see a coworker joking around. But no one was there. My heart raced as I stood frozen for a moment before forcing myself to keep walking. It wasn't long before I started hearing voices. They were faint, just on the edge of audibility, like someone whispering from far away. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone felt wrong. I told myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. But then I saw her. It was just after midnight, and I was descending the staircase to the ground floor. The building was silent except for the muffled ticking of a clock in the distance. As I turned the corner, I caught sight of her. She was standing at the end of the hallway, peeking out from a bathroom doorway. Her skin glowed faintly, casting an eerie light that barely illuminated the dark corridor. Her hair was long and straggly, hanging over her shoulders in limp strands. She had no face. The smooth, featureless surface where her eyes, nose, and mouth should have been was somehow more terrifying than any expression she could have worn. Despite this, I felt her gaze on me, cold and unrelenting. For a moment, I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the spot as my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. Then, instinct took over. I turned and bolted back up the stairs, my footsteps echoing wildly. When I told my coworker about her later, she just nodded. "You saw her too?" "Huh." The glowing woman was only the beginning. Over time, I began hearing stories from the other night shift staff about the Shadow Man. "He's different," one of them told me. "Not like the woman. She just watches. He gets closer." I laughed it off at first, thinking it was just another ghost story to pass the time. But that changed when I saw him myself. It was a particularly quiet night. Another coworker and I were cleaning the corridor by the living rooms, venting about work frustrations. As we talked, a sudden banging erupted from all the living rooms at once. The sound was deafening, as though every object in the rooms had been thrown against the walls. I shouted, "Be quiet," without thinking, trying to mask my growing fear. The noise stopped abruptly, plunging the hallway into an eerie silence. My coworker's face went pale as she whispered, "Don't turn around." "What?" I asked, my voice trembling. "He's behind you." The air around me grew icy, and I could feel the weight of a presence at my back. My heart pounded as I stood frozen, afraid to move. After what felt like an eternity, The oppressive sensation lifted, and my coworker let out a shaky breath. When I finally turned, there was nothing there. The most terrifying experience happened months later. It was a little past 2 a.m. when the first scream echoed through the halls. "Help me!" The voice was sharp and desperate, cutting through the silence like a knife. My coworker and I immediately ran toward the source. But when we checked the rooms, every resident was sound asleep. The screams continued, moving up and down the hallways. They seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. No matter where we ran, we could never catch up to them. As we stopped to regroup, the bathroom door, the same one where I'd seen the glowing woman, began shaking violently. The sound of banging reverberated through the corridor, louder and more frantic with each passing second. Without a word, we bolted back to the staff room and locked the door. For the rest of the night, we huddled together, too afraid to leave. I eventually left the care home, unable to bear the constant dread that came with each night shift. But even now, I can't shake the memories. The footsteps, the whispers, the glowing woman, and the shadow man, they're etched into my mind like scars. What do you think is behind these hauntings? Are they the restless spirits of the care home's tragic past? Or is something darker at play? Would you have stayed after experiencing this? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells for more chilling stories. Some places aren't just haunted, they're alive with things we'll never truly understand. Would you dare work the night shift? Story 3, The Museum Hauntings. There's something unnerving about museums at night. During the day, they're vibrant, teeming with visitors. The murmur of voices blending with the occasional creak of old floorboards. But when night falls, the silence creeps in, heavy and suffocating. It was during one of these nights, while working security at the museum, that I realized silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the weight of something watching. The museum I worked at wasn't just old, it was ancient. A sprawling building filled with artifacts that carried the weight of thousands of years of history. I had always loved history, but nothing could prepare me for the night I saw it, the shadow that moved through the treasure chamber, weaving between exhibits like it belonged there. You'd think I would have quit after that. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. I stayed. And what I discovered still keeps me awake at night. Would you have stayed to find out what hides in the museum's darkness? The museum was a haven for history lovers during the day, a maze of artifacts, grand halls, and meticulously preserved relics. But at night, it transformed. The corridors stretched endlessly. The shadows seemed darker, and the whispers of the past felt all too real. I'd been working there for 6 months as a security officer. The day shifts were easy enough, spent ensuring nothing was out of place while indulging in the privilege of wandering the exhibits. But it was the night shifts that earned the job its reputation. Keep an eye on the treasure chamber, one of the older guards had told me during my first night shift. That's where they like to play. Who's they? I asked, laughing nervously. He didn't answer, just gave me a knowing look before leaving me alone with my thoughts. That first night, I didn't see anything unusual, but I felt it. The air in the treasure chamber was heavier, like walking into a room that had been sealed off for decades. The artifacts seemed to hum with energy, and no matter where I stood, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't long before the strange occurrences began. One night, while making my rounds, I passed an ancient Egyptian sarcophagus displayed under dim, golden light. As I walked by, I heard it, a faint murmur, almost imperceptible, coming from the exhibit. I stopped and leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass case. The sound was clearer now, a hushed, rhythmic whisper, like a chant in a language I couldn't understand. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty hall. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving only the oppressive silence of the museum. My heart pounded as I stared at the sarcophagus, half expecting it to move. When nothing happened, I shook my head and moved on, convincing myself it was my imagination. But as I walked away, the whispering started again. The treasure chamber was the crown jewel of the museum. It housed priceless artifacts, glittering jewelry, intricately carved statues, and ancient scrolls. But it was also the most unnerving place in the entire building. Every time I entered, I felt like I was intruding, like the room itself resented my presence. The air was colder there, and the artifacts seemed to exude a quiet hostility. One particular night, I was scanning my checkpoint badge in the chamber when I noticed something unusual. Near an ornate painting of an 18th century nobleman, faint tendrils of light seemed to dance in the air. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But the tendrils moved with purpose, weaving and twisting like living things. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The air grew colder, and a low, almost imperceptible hum filled the room. Suddenly, I felt a sharp tug on my shoulder, as if someone were trying to pull me back. I turned around, but there was no one there. The pinnacle of my terror came on a night I'll never forget. It was late, well past midnight, and I was in the treasure chamber once again. This time, the atmosphere felt different. The cold was biting, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally. As I walked toward the far end of the chamber, I saw it. A shadow, darker than any I'd ever seen, moved between the exhibits. It had no discernible form, just an amorphous mass that seemed to glide effortlessly through the room. My breath caught in my throat as it stopped near the sarcophagus I'd seen earlier. The shadow hovered there for a moment before turning, yes, turning, toward me. I say, turning, because I felt its attention shift, like an invisible gaze locking onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it surged forward, faster than I thought possible. I stumbled backward, crashing into a display case as the shadow loomed over me. The air around me grew suffocatingly cold, and a deep, guttural sound echoed in my ears, like a growl or a low, mocking laugh. Just as I thought the shadow would engulf me, the overhead lights flickered violently, and it vanished. Shaken, I fled to the security office, where my coworker was waiting. He took one look at my pale, trembling face and nodded knowingly. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked. When I described what had happened, he shared his own experience. "The same thing happened to me near that painting. It grabbed my shoulder, just like it did to you. That room, it's alive in a way. Like it remembers things." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged. "Something tied to the artifacts. Maybe. Or maybe it's always been here, and we just woke it up. I still work at the museum, but I avoid the treasure chamber whenever I can. Some nights, I hear the whispers again, or catch a glimpse of a shadow darting through the halls. What do you think is behind these hauntings? Is it the history tied to the artifacts? Or is the building itself alive, Would you have stayed after encountering the shadow? Story 4, The Pub's Ghostly Guest. Old pubs have a way of clinging to their secrets. Maybe it's the history soaked into the walls, or the countless lives that have passed through their doors, leaving behind whispers of their stories. Whatever it is, the pub where I worked had more than its fair share of secrets, and I found out the hard way. At first, I thought it was just a job. Pour drinks, chat with the regulars, and clean up at the end of the night. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice things. Small, unsettling things. A chair would scrape across the floor when no one was near it. The TVs would flicker on and off without warning. And sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that didn't belong to anyone living. But the worst was the man. Tall, with a long beard and a coat that seemed out of place in this century. He first appeared to me one quiet night. I thought he was just another patron. I was wrong. Have you ever seen something you couldn't explain? What would you do if it stared back at you? The pub wasn't just old, it was ancient by modern standards. Built in the early 1700s. It had served as a meeting place for villagers, a hideout for smugglers, and even a makeshift hospital during a cholera outbreak. Its walls had seen everything: joy, sorrow, violence, and death. The locals had plenty of stories to share. Some claimed to hear faint laughter late at night, long after the bar had emptied. Others spoke of cold spots in the cellar, where a smuggler had supposedly been murdered. And then there was the tale of the bearded man, a restless spirit said to wander the pub's lower levels. As a skeptic, I didn't put much stock in these stories. I chalked them up to overactive imaginations fueled by strong ale. But then the strange occurrences began. One of the first incidents I witnessed involved the TVs. The pub had 6 of them, mounted in various corners, usually showing sports or music videos. They were reliable, until they weren't. One night, my co-workers and I decided to play a prank on a new hire. She was tasked with turning off the TVs at closing time. So we hid behind the bar, remote in hand, ready to turn them back on. It started as planned. She switched off the first TV, and we turned it back on. She muttered under her breath, clearly annoyed, and went to turn it off again. This time, before we could do anything, all 6 TVs flickered on simultaneously, their screens glowing with static. "What the hell?" she gasped, backing away. We stepped out, laughing nervously, assuming it was some kind of glitch. But then the laughter started. It was faint at first, like someone chuckling in the distance. Then it grew louder, echoing through the empty pub. It wasn't any of us. And it wasn't coming from the TVs. It sounded wrong. We shut everything down and left in a hurry, brushing it off as a technical malfunction. But deep down, we knew better. It was a slow Tuesday night when I first saw him. Most of the patrons had gone home, leaving only a few stragglers nursing their final pints. I was cleaning glasses behind the bar when my manager asked me to grab something from the staff room downstairs. The staff area was tucked away behind a narrow staircase, past the cellar door. The corridor was dimly lit, and the air grew colder the further you descended. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a long, scruffy beard and a coat that looked like it belonged to a different era. He stood just outside the staff room, his back turned to me. "Hey, the bar's closed," I called out. He didn't move. I took a step closer. My unease growing. "Sir. You can't be down here." Still no response. When I reached out to tap his shoulder, he turned and vanished. I ran back upstairs, my heart pounding. My manager saw my face and immediately knew something had happened. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, too shaken to speak. Over the next few days, I started asking questions. The regulars told me about the pub's violent past, about a smuggler who had been cornered in the cellar and murdered by rivals. "They say he still roams the pub," one of them said, "looking for something he lost." But it wasn't just the smuggler. There were stories about a barmaid who had died in a fire, and a young boy who had fallen from the stairs. The pub wasn't haunted by one ghost, it was teeming with them. The most terrifying experience happened late one night. My manager and I were closing up when we realized we were short on a barrel of beer. She asked me to grab one from the cellar. The cellar was even colder than usual, and the air felt heavy, like walking through water. I found the barrel quickly and was about to head back up when I heard it, the sound of footsteps on the stone floor. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The footsteps stopped. I turned toward the noise and saw him. The bearded man stood at the far end of the cellar, partially obscured by shadows. His eyes glinted faintly in the dim light, and for a moment, I thought I saw anger in his expression. I froze, unable to move or speak. Then, without warning, the door to the cellar slammed shut. Panic set in as I fumbled for my phone, the weak flashlight barely piercing the darkness. The bearded man began to move toward me, his footsteps eerily silent. "Leave me alone," I shouted, backing into the wall. The light flickered, and when it stabilized, he was gone. I bolted up the stairs, my hands trembling as I struggled with the door. When I finally burst into the bar, my manager was waiting, her face pale. "He doesn't like people in his space," she said quietly. "I should have warned you. I still work at the pub, but I've learned to respect its ghosts. The TVs still flicker, chairs still move, and sometimes I feel the cold brush of something unseen. But the bearded man hasn't appeared to me again. What do you think keeps him tied to this place? Is it unfinished business? Or is he simply a part of the pub now? As much as its old wooden beams and creaking floors? Would you keep working in a place like this? Or would you run the moment you saw something you couldn't explain?" Story 5: The Domestic Violence Shelter. When I first took the overnight shift at the domestic violence shelter, I thought the most frightening things I'd face were emergencies, midnight calls from panicked residents, or strangers trying to break in. But I was wrong. The shelter wasn't just a sanctuary for those fleeing danger. It was old, worn, and full of shadows. And sometimes it felt like those shadows had lives of their own. The building groaned and sighed like it was breathing. And the deeper the night grew, the heavier the air became. It wasn't long before I started noticing things. Footsteps echoed in empty hallways. Doors opened on their own. And in the dead of night, I heard voices, soft, faint whispers that sent chills racing up my spine. At first, I told myself it was just the stress of the job or my imagination running wild in the silence. But then I saw the shadow, a tall, humanoid figure lurking at the end of the hallway. Just standing there, watching. Would you have stayed to face what hides in the dark? The shelter wasn't originally built as a refuge. Decades ago, it had been a boarding house. And before that, a private residence. Rumors swirled among the staff about its past, a tragedy here, a mysterious disappearance there. Some believed the building had absorbed the emotions of its history, like a sponge soaking up sorrow, fear, and rage. Even during the day, there was something off about the place. The long hallways felt too narrow. The light struggled to reach certain corners. And there were spots where the temperature always seemed colder, no matter the season. But at night, the building felt alive, like it was waiting for something. My first few weeks on the night shift were quiet enough. I'd do hourly walkthroughs, check that the doors were locked, and ensure the residents were safe. Most of the time, the shelter felt empty, with the occasional creak or groan from the old wooden floors keeping me company. But one night, as I was walking through the women's wing, I heard it, faint footsteps behind me. I stopped, the sound echoing into the silence. "Hello?" I called out, turning around. No one was there. I continued my rounds, trying to shake off the unease. But the footsteps returned, louder this time, as though someone was hurrying to catch up with me. I spun around, expecting to see a resident or coworker. But the hallway was empty again. The air felt colder suddenly, and a chill crawled up my spine. I finished my rounds quickly that night, constantly looking over my shoulder. It wasn't long before the footsteps were joined by something even more unsettling, whispers. I was sitting in the office one night, catching up on paperwork, when I heard it for the first time, a soft, faint voice. At first, I thought it was one of the residents speaking in her room. But the voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I strained to make out the words, but they were indistinct. Like the voice wasn't speaking to me, but around me. The whispers grew louder over the next few nights. Sometimes, they sounded angry, like a heated argument just out of earshot. Other times, they were desperate, pleading. One night, as I passed through the hallway separating the men's and women's wings, I heard a woman's voice clearly for the first time. "Help me," she whispered. I froze, my heart pounding. The men's wing was supposed to be empty, locked up for the night. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Help me." I unlocked the door and stepped inside, shining my flashlight into the darkened corridor. The beam illuminated empty rooms, neatly made beds, and silence. No one was there. There was one part of the shelter that everyone avoided at night, the long hallway leading to the laundry room. "That hallway's cursed," my coworker joked one evening, though her tone was far too serious to be playful. "Bad things happen down there." I brushed off her words until I experienced it for myself. One night, I had to walk that hallway alone. The air grew colder with every step, and the shadows seemed to shift as my flashlight beam passed over them. Halfway down the hallway, I felt it, an overwhelming sense of dread. Like something was standing right behind me. I froze, too afraid to turn around. My breath caught in my throat as I felt the faintest brush of cold air against the back of my neck. Gathering every ounce of courage, I spun around. But there was nothing there. Or so I thought. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the far corner of the hallway. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze boring into me. My hands shook as I hurried down the hallway, refusing to look back. The most terrifying encounter happened on a night when I was alone in the office. My coworker had called in sick, leaving me to handle the shift on my own. Around 2 a.m. As I reviewed some files, I heard a noise outside the office, a faint shuffling sound. I stepped into the hallway, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. "Hello?" I called out. The noise stopped. I stood there for a moment, listening. That's when I saw it. The shadowy figure was back, standing at the far end of the hallway. This time, it wasn't still. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate. I stumbled back into the office, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone. But when I glanced back toward the hallway through the small office window, the shadow was gone. The rest of the night passed in tense silence, every creak and groan of the building setting my nerves on edge. I stayed at the shelter for several more months, but the shadowy figure haunted me every night. The whispers, the footsteps, the cold spots, they became a regular part of the job. To this day, I don't know what I experienced. Was it the lingering energy of the shelter's past? Or something darker? Something tied to the building itself? What do you think? Are places like this haunted by the memories of those who sought refuge there? Or is there something deeper at work? Would you have stayed? Or would you have left after the first shadow appeared? Story 6: The Gas Station Encounter. Night shifts at gas stations are lonely affairs. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the rhythmic swish of passing cars on the highway, and the faint buzz of the neon sign outside are your only company. Most nights, you're lucky to see a handful of customers, truckers looking for coffee, locals grabbing a midnight snack, or the occasional lost traveler. But every so often, something happens that makes the quiet unbearable. It was just after 2 a.m. when she came in. The doorbell jingled softly, announcing her arrival. She was small, frail, and leaned heavily on a battered cane. Her eyes were tired, her face lined with age, and her thin coat seemed ill-suited for the chilly autumn night. "Do you carry?" she began, her voice quivering. But her words trailed off as she glanced toward the back of the store. I was about to respond when a chill swept through the room, freezing the words in my throat. Something about her felt wrong. I couldn't explain it then. But the air seemed heavier, the silence sharper, like the world had shifted. That was the night everything changed. Have you ever met someone who didn't feel quite real? What would you do if they asked for something they'd already lost? The gas station where I worked wasn't anything special, a squat, weathered building just off the highway, open 24/7 for travelers and locals alike. Its flickering neon sign cast an eerie red glow over the parking lot, and the interior smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaning supplies. Most of the time, I liked the solitude of the night shift. It gave me a chance to think, to enjoy the quiet. But there were nights when the silence felt oppressive, like the building itself was watching me. That night had started out uneventfully. The radio played softly in the background as I wiped down the counter, and the occasional roar of a passing semi kept me grounded. Then the doorbell jingled, and the old woman entered. Her cane clicked against the tile floor as she shuffled toward the counter. Her coat was threadbare, and her hair was pinned back in a neat bun. She looked around as if unsure of where she was. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful. Her eyes flicked to me, then back toward the darkened aisles. "Do you have," she began, but her voice faltered. She looked toward the back of the store, her expression shifting to one of unease. "Ma'am?" I prompted gently. She blinked and shook her head. "Never mind," she muttered, turning toward the door. I was about to ask if she was okay when she was gone. The bell didn't ring. The door didn't move. And the parking lot outside was empty. The next morning, I visited my grandmother, as I often did after a night shift. She always had the local newspaper spread out on the kitchen table, and she loved pointing out obituaries of people she'd known. As she handed me the paper, something caught my eye. There, nestled among the obituaries, was a familiar face. The old woman. I stared at her picture, my heart pounding. The obituary said she had passed away 2 months ago. "That's impossible," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What's wrong, dear?" my grandmother asked, peering at me over her glasses. "Nothing," I lied, folding the paper. But my mind was racing. Had I imagined the encounter? Or was there another explanation? After that, the gas station didn't feel the same. The air seemed colder, even when the heat was cranked up. The flickering lights, which had always been an annoyance, now felt ominous. And there was a new sound, a faint tapping, like the rhythmic click of a cane against the floor. One night, as I restocked the shelves, I heard the tapping again. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the sound grew louder, more insistent. I turned around, half expecting to see the old woman standing there. But the store was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. I quickly finished my task and returned to the counter, my hands shaking. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A few nights later, I decided to check the security footage. The cameras had been acting up lately, and I wanted to make sure they were still recording properly. As I fast-forwarded through the previous night's footage, something caught my eye. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of the frame, a shadow that moved unnaturally. I rewound the tape and played it again, my heart pounding. The footage showed the store empty, the aisles dimly lit by the overhead lights. But then, near the back of the store, a shadow appeared. It didn't belong to anyone or anything. It was tall, featureless, and seemed to glide across the floor. I watched, frozen, as the shadow moved closer to the counter, closer to where I had been sitting. Then it vanished. The last time I saw her was on a stormy night. Rain pelted the windows, and the wind howled outside, rattling the glass. I was alone, trying to distract myself by organizing the candy aisle. Around 3 a.m., the bell above the door jingled. I looked up, expecting to see a soaked traveler or a trucker seeking shelter. Instead, it was her. The old woman stood in the doorway, her cane in hand. This time, she looked different, more solid, more present. Her eyes bore into mine, filled with something I couldn't quite place: anger, sadness, desperation. "Ma'am," I said cautiously, stepping out from behind the counter. She didn't respond. Instead, she pointed toward the back of the store. Her hand trembled, and her lips moved, but no sound came out. I turned to look where she was pointing, but the aisles were empty. When I looked back, she was gone. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my phone and checked the security footage. The camera showed me standing at the counter, staring at nothing. I don't work at the gas station anymore, but I still think about that night. Who was she? Why did she come to me? And what was she trying to show me? Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if she still visits the station, wandering the aisles, searching for something she lost, or maybe something she wants me to find. What would you do if a ghost appeared in front of you? Would you help them? Or would you run? Story 7, The Stalker. It began with a smile. At first, I thought he was just another customer, a quiet man with an unassuming presence, dressed in a jacket that had seen better days. He wasn't overly chatty like some of the regulars, but he always had this smile. It wasn't friendly, nor was it menacing. It just lingered too long, making me feel exposed, like he could see something I hadn't intended to show. I worked evening shifts at a retail store, mostly closing alone. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I'd grown used to the quiet nights and the monotony of counting inventory under the dull hum of fluorescent lights. But after a while, he stopped feeling like just another customer. He started coming in almost every night, usually close to closing time. He always asked the same kinds of questions, personal, but wrapped in a friendly tone. Must be tiring working so late. What time do you get off? You live nearby? It was subtle at first, harmless, even. But one night, as I locked up and walked to my car, I saw his car idling at the edge of the parking lot. He didn't move, didn't wave, just watched. That's when the fear began. Have you ever felt someone watching you, even when you're alone? Would you ignore it? Or would you run? The first time he came into the store, I didn't think much of it. He bought a pack of gum and a bottle of water, exchanged a polite smile, and left. He looked like any other customer, maybe a little older than our typical crowd, with unkempt hair and a faint tiredness in his eyes. The second time, he lingered. Busy night, he asked, leaning casually against the counter. Not really, I replied, forcing a polite smile. You're always working when I come by. Don't they ever let you rest? I shrugged. Someone's gotta keep the place running. It wasn't the words that unsettled me, it was his tone. He spoke like we were old friends, like he knew me. I brushed it off, assuming he was just one of those overly familiar types who didn't realize how uncomfortable he was making me. But then he kept coming back. As the days turned into weeks, his visits became routine. He always showed up during my evening shifts, always found a reason to linger by the counter. You're here every time I stop by, he said once, his smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Do you ever get a day off? Not often, I replied, hoping the conversation would end there. You live nearby? He asked, his tone too casual. I hesitated, my instincts telling me to lie. Not really. Long drive home. He nodded, as if filing the information away. Well, be careful out there. Lots of weirdos these days. The irony wasn't lost on me. After that night, I started feeling uneasy at work. Every time I saw him pull into the lot, my chest tightened. I began avoiding eye contact, keeping our conversations brief. But it didn't deter him. If anything, it made him linger longer, as if he enjoyed the tension. One night, after a particularly slow shift, I locked up and headed to my car. The parking lot was empty except for one vehicle, his. The car was parked a few rows away. Its headlights off. Engine idling. My stomach twisted as I realized he was waiting. I debated going back inside. But the store was already locked. And I didn't want to make it obvious that I was scared. Instead, I clutched my keys tightly and walked briskly to my car. Glancing over my shoulder. He didn't move. Once inside my car, I locked the doors and started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I saw his headlights flicker on. My heart raced as I watched his car in my rearview mirror. He followed me. I took a detour through a series of side streets, hoping to lose him. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my pulse pounding in my ears. After several tense minutes, his car finally turned off in another direction. I sat in my driveway for a long time that night, too afraid to go inside. The next day, I reported the incident to my manager. She seemed concerned but ultimately shrugged it off. Customers can be weird sometimes. Just be careful, she said. But the stalker wasn't done. A week later, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. It was written in neat, precise handwriting. You looked beautiful last night. Be safe. My blood ran cold. I started parking closer to the building, hoping the added light and security cameras would deter him. It didn't. The notes kept coming. Sometimes they were simple compliments. Other times they were cryptic. I feel like I've known you forever. It's dangerous to walk alone at night. I reported each incident. But nothing changed. The police took my statement but said there wasn't much they could do without concrete evidence. The breaking point came one rainy night. The store was quiet. The kind of night where time seemed to drag. I was finishing my closing routine when the power flickered, plunging the store into near darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the breaker box in the back room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I flipped the switch, I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps outside the door. Hello? I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I stepped cautiously into the main area of the store, shining my flashlight toward the entrance. He was standing there. His clothes were soaked from the rain, and his smile was gone. He looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. Why are you hiding from me? He asked, his voice low and steady. I backed away, my hand trembling as I reached for my phone. You need to leave, I said, trying to keep my voice firm. He took a step closer. I just want to talk. Get out, or I'm calling the police, I shouted, my voice cracking. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out into the rain. That was the last time I saw him. I quit the job shortly after, unable to shake the fear that he might come back. Sometimes, I still feel like I'm being watched. Every time I walk to my car at night. Every time I see a shadow move in the corner of my eye. I wonder if it's him. What would you do if someone invaded your life like this? How far would you go to protect yourself? Story 8, The Warehouse Shadows. Working alone at night can make anyone paranoid. But there's a difference between hearing the occasional creak of an old building and knowing, deep in your gut, that you're not alone. I worked as a night guard at a massive warehouse. It was the kind of job most people wouldn't think twice about, easy money for walking the same dull rounds night after night. But from the moment I started, the place felt wrong. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the way the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, as if they were struggling to stay on. It was the shadows. At first, I thought it was my tired mind playing tricks on me. But shadows don't move on their own. And they definitely don't watch you. One night, as I was patrolling the far end of the building, I felt it, a presence that sent chills racing up my spine. When I turned, there it was, a figure. Tall and dark. Standing perfectly still at the end of the aisle. When I called out, it didn't respond. And when I stepped closer, it vanished into the dark. Have you ever worked somewhere so unsettling that you started questioning your own sanity? What would you do if the shadows began to move? The warehouse was enormous. A sprawling maze of towering shelves and endless aisles. It stored everything you could think of, electronics, furniture, clothing, stacked high in neat, orderly rows. By day, it bustled with forklifts and workers shouting to one another, their voices bouncing off the walls. But at night, the warehouse was a different beast. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights and the occasional metallic creak of the shelves settling. The air always felt colder, too, like the building itself was holding its breath. I started noticing odd things during my first week. Little details that didn't make sense. Boxes shifted from one spot to another without explanation. Lights flickered in areas that weren't supposed to have electrical issues. But the strangest part was the shadows. It was on my fourth night when I first noticed something unusual. I was walking my rounds, the flashlight in my hand cutting through the dimness. Everything was quiet, just the way I liked it. As I passed aisle 23, something caught my eye, a shadow that moved against the far wall. It was quick, disappearing before I could fully register it. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing into the silence. Nothing. I swept my flashlight down the aisle. But it was empty. Just rows of neatly stacked boxes and towering shelves. Still, the feeling lingered, that prickling sense of being watched. I finished my rounds that night with a tightness in my chest that didn't ease until I was back in my car, driving home. Over the following weeks, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. At first, it was just subtle things, a faint rustling sound, like someone moving between the shelves, or a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. But then the shadows started becoming more distinct. One night, as I passed through the loading dock, I saw it, a figure, tall and humanoid, standing perfectly still near the garage door. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its attention locked on me. I stepped closer, my flashlight shaking in my hand. But as the light swept over the spot where it had been, the figure dissolved into the darkness. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The strangest area in the warehouse was aisle 36. No matter how warm the rest of the building was, that aisle always felt freezing cold. At first, I thought it was due to a vent overhead. But even when the air conditioning was off, the chill remained. It wasn't just the temperature, though, it was the atmosphere. Walking down aisle 36 felt like stepping into a different world. The air seemed heavier, the silence deeper. One night, as I walked down the aisle, my breath fogged in front of me. I stopped in my tracks, shining my flashlight ahead. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the aisle, a shadow stretched across the floor, long and thin, like the silhouette of a person standing just out of sight. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The shadow didn't move. Slowly, I stepped closer, each footstep echoing in the silence. But as I reached the end of the aisle, the shadow disappeared. There was no one there. The most terrifying night came during a thunderstorm. The power had gone out across the city, leaving the warehouse plunged into near-total darkness. The emergency lights flickered on, casting eerie shadows across the aisles. With the cameras down and the backup generator running low, I was on edge. My flashlight became my only lifeline as I moved through the building, the beam cutting through the gloom. As I passed through aisle 36, the light in my hand flickered. I smacked it against my palm, trying to steady the beam, but it cut out entirely, leaving me in the faint glow of the emergency lights. That's when I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps moving closer. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. I turned back toward the aisle and froze. The shadow was there, taller than I'd ever seen it, its form shifting and writhing as if it were alive. It began to move toward me, slow and deliberate. The air around me grew icy cold, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the space, like a growl or a deep, mocking laugh. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. I scrambled for the exit, the sound of my own panicked breaths filling my ears. As I reached the door, I glanced back one last time. The shadow was gone, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. I quit the job the next day. Whatever was in that warehouse, I wanted no part of it. But the shadows didn't leave me. Even now, months later, I sometimes feel them when I'm alone at night, when the lights flicker in my apartment, when a cold draft brushes against my skin. What do you think was haunting the warehouse? Was it tied to the building? Or could it have followed me home? Story 9, The Motel Intrusion. Motels have always had a certain charm, haven't they? The anonymity, the simplicity, the sense of being untethered. But they also carry a darker undercurrent, a reminder that anyone can rent a room next to yours, that the thin walls don't always keep danger out. I learned this lesson the hard way during a late-night stop at a roadside motel. It wasn't the kind of place you'd rave about: faded signage, a broken vending machine in the lobby, and a parking lot sparsely lit by flickering lights. I just needed a bed for the night before continuing my drive the next morning. But sometime after midnight, I awoke to the sound of someone jiggling my doorknob. At first, I thought it was a mistake, someone confusing their room for mine. But then came the knock, deliberate, insistent. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. And then, the scratching began. Have you ever stayed somewhere that made you question how safe you really were? What would you do if you couldn't trust the lock on your door? The motel wasn't my first choice. I'd been driving for hours, the highway stretching endlessly under the weight of my exhaustion, when I saw the dimly lit vacancy sign flickering in the distance. I pulled over without a second thought. The receptionist was a tired-looking man who barely glanced up from his crossword puzzle as I paid for the room. "Room 7, he muttered, sliding a key across the counter. "Lock sticks sometimes, but it'll close." The room was as bare bones as I'd expected: a sagging bed, a TV from the 90s, and curtains that didn't quite meet in the middle. The faint smell of mildew clung to the air, but I was too tired to care. I double-checked the door lock before collapsing onto the bed. The sound of the highway outside was oddly comforting. A reminder that I wasn't completely isolated. But as I drifted off, that comfort turned to unease. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. The room was still. The highway outside quieter now. But then I heard it, the faint, metallic rattle of the doorknob turning. My heart began to race as I sat up in bed, straining to hear. Maybe it was the wind, I told myself. Or someone drunk, trying the wrong room. "Hello?" I called out, hoping to startle whoever it was into leaving. No response. For a moment, everything was silent. Then came the knock, soft but deliberate. Like someone testing my resolve. "Who is it?" I demanded, my voice sharper now. Still nothing. I grabbed my phone, opening the flashlight app to illuminate the small room. The thought of unlocking the door to check made my stomach churn. So I stayed frozen, hoping whoever it was would move on. Instead, the sound changed. Scratching. It started low, almost imperceptible, like nails dragging against the wood. But it grew louder, more frantic, until it sounded like claws tearing at the door. I crept toward the window, careful not to make a sound. Peeking through the gap in the curtains, I saw him. A man stood just outside my door, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. He wasn't moving, just standing there with one hand pressed against the doorframe, the other dragging something sharp across the wood. My stomach turned as I noticed the object in his hand, a jagged piece of metal. Maybe part of a coat hanger. He was using it to pick at the lock. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as I realized how vulnerable I was. Should I call the front desk? The police? My hands shook as I dialed the number for the motel office. The line rang once, twice, then clicked. "Front desk," the receptionist answered, his voice groggy. "There's someone outside my room," I whispered, glancing back toward the door. "He's trying to get in." A pause. "Room 7? "Yes." Another pause. Longer this time. "Stay inside. Don't open the door." Before I could respond, the line went dead. A minute later, the room was plunged into darkness. The overhead light flickered once, then went out completely. I froze, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The hallway outside was dark too, the faint light under the door now gone. Then, the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth outside my door. Every so often, they stopped, only to resume seconds later. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to make out any other sounds. But all I could hear was my own breathing, shallow and panicked. "Are you in there?" a voice finally called out, muffled by the door. It wasn't the receptionist. The scratching returned, louder and more frantic than before. The doorknob rattled violently, and I could hear the groan of the lock straining against the man's attempts to force it open. I backed away, my eyes darting around the room for anything I could use to defend myself. The only thing within reach was the cheap metal lamp on the bedside table. The doorframe cracked as the lock gave way, the door swinging open to reveal the man. His hood had fallen back, revealing a gaunt, pale face with sunken eyes. His lips twisted into a smile that made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have stayed here," he said, his voice low and raspy. He stepped into the room, the jagged piece of metal glinting in his hand. Adrenaline took over. I swung the lamp with all my strength, the base connecting with his arm. He stumbled, the metal object clattering to the floor. I didn't wait to see if he'd recover. I bolted past him, sprinting down the hallway toward the front desk. The receptionist was gone. The lobby was empty. The phone on the desk off the hook. I ran outside, my bare feet slapping against the cold pavement as I made it to my car. Fumbling with the keys, I finally managed to unlock the door and jump inside. As I sped out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man stood in the middle of the lot, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I reached a well-lit gas station miles down the road. My hands were still shaking as I called the police, reporting the break-in and the motel's eerie silence. When the officers arrived, they found the front desk abandoned and room 7 empty. There was no sign of the man or the receptionist, but the scratches on the door told a story they couldn't ignore. To this day, I don't know who the man was or why he targeted me. All I know is that I'll never stay in a roadside motel again. Have you ever stayed somewhere that made your skin crawl? How would you react if someone tried to break into your room in the middle of the night? Story 10: The Delivery Gone Wrong. It was supposed to be a routine delivery, a late-night drop-off to a house just outside the city. The address was strange, tucked into the middle of nowhere. But these things happen when you work as a delivery driver. People live in weird places. As I pulled off the highway and onto a narrow dirt road, the uneasy feeling in my gut grew stronger. The GPS kept glitching, rerouting me to nowhere. And the road ahead was swallowed by trees that loomed like skeletal hands in the dark. Finally, I saw it, a single porch light glowing faintly in the distance. The house was old, its paint peeling, its windows black like lifeless eyes. I stepped out of the car, clutching the package tightly. That's when I heard it, a faint, high-pitched giggle coming from the woods behind me. "Hello?" I called out, spinning around. No answer. But I could feel it, something watching, waiting. Would you have continued the delivery? What would you do if the darkness started closing in? I started my shift like any other night. My job wasn't glamorous, driving around, dropping off packages, dealing with the occasional grumpy customer, but it paid the bills. I usually liked the quiet hours of the late shift. The roads were emptier, and there was something peaceful about working under the stars. This delivery, though, felt off from the start. The order came through just after midnight, with an address I didn't recognize. It was listed as Ridgeway Drive, but when I punched it into the GPS it took me somewhere completely different, a series of back roads leading to nothing but forests and fields. Great, I muttered, resetting the app and trying again. The second attempt worked, or so I thought. The GPS chirped happily as it directed me to take a sharp left onto an unmarked dirt road. The headlights of my car barely cut through the dense fog that had settled over the area. Estimated arrival, 5 minutes, the robotic voice assured me. But as the minutes ticked by, the road grew narrower, the trees pressing in closer. My gut told me to turn around, but the stubborn part of me wanted to finish the job. The house appeared out of nowhere, its faint porch light flickering in the distance like a dying star. It was a 2-story structure, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The roof sagged, and the wooden planks on the porch were warped and splintered. I parked my car and stepped out, clutching the small brown package in one hand. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for this time of year, and eerily still. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely carrying in the silence. No response. As I approached the house, I noticed something odd. The windows weren't just dark, they were blacked out. As if someone had painted over them from the inside. A faint smell of mildew and decay hung in the air. When I reached the porch, I hesitated. The package felt heavier in my hand. Though I knew that was impossible. I knocked on the door. Once. Twice. Nothing. Just as I was about to leave the package on the porch, I heard it, a soft, high-pitched giggle coming from the woods behind me. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. It wasn't the laugh of a child or even a woman. It was too sharp. Too unnatural. Like it didn't belong to anything human. Who's there? I called out, turning toward the sound. The woods were silent again. The shadows between the trees deep and impenetrable. All right. Not funny. I muttered, trying to steady my breathing. I placed the package on the porch and turned back toward my car. That's when I noticed the fog had thickened, curling around the trees like it was alive. My car, which I could have sworn was just a few yards away, now seemed impossibly far. The giggling returned. Louder this time. And closer. As I hurried back to the car, the sound of creaking wood stopped me in my tracks. I turned back toward the house, my stomach dropping as I saw the front door slowly swinging open. Hello? I called out, my voice trembling. The interior of the house was pitch black, the faint porch light barely illuminating the threshold. For a moment, I thought I saw something move inside, a shadow. Quick and fluid. Darting out of sight. Look. I'm just the delivery guy, I said. More to myself than anyone else. I'll leave the package here and go. I started walking backward, keeping my eyes on the house. That's when the giggling came again. Louder. And from multiple directions this time. Who's out there? I demanded, spinning around. The fog parted slightly, revealing faint shapes moving between the trees. They were tall, thin, and hunched, their movements jerky and unnatural. I didn't wait to see what they were. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys as I heard the sound of footsteps, many footsteps, crunching through the leaves behind me. I slammed the car door shut and locked it, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. The headlights cut through the fog, revealing nothing but the empty road ahead. Come on. Come on. I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. Not now. I shouted, trying again. This time, the engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse, spinning it around on the narrow road. But as I pressed the gas, the fog thickened, swallowing everything outside the beams of my headlights. The road seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. I should have been back on the main highway by now. But no matter how far I drove, the trees and fog stretched on forever. Then, the figures appeared in the road ahead. There were 3 of them, standing motionless in the headlights. Their faces, or what should have been faces, were featureless, smooth and pale like wax. I swerved to avoid them, the car skidding as I fought to stay on the road. The giggling was everywhere now, echoing through the fog, and the shapes moved alongside the car, keeping pace with impossible speed. When I finally broke free of the fog, the sun was rising, My car screeched onto the highway. The sound of tires on asphalt jolting me back to reality. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest gas station. Shaking, I stepped out of the car and checked the back seat, half expecting to see one of those figures waiting for me. But it was empty. The package I had delivered, it was gone. To this day, I don't know what I encountered on that dirt road or in the woods. I've stopped taking night shifts, and I never trust GPS blindly anymore. What do you think was in the package? And who, or what, was waiting for me at the house? As the stories draw to a close, you might be left with a chilling thought: what truly waits for us in the dark? Each of these tales, from eerie motels and haunted warehouses to spectral stalkers and strange deliveries, leaves us questioning what's real and what isn't. But maybe the most terrifying question of all is, what if these aren't just stories? Think about it. When was the last time you truly felt alone? Maybe it was walking to your car late at night, or lying in bed, listening to the creaks of an old house. Did you ever stop to wonder if you were actually being watched? The truth is, the world is filled with unexplained phenomena, things we can't see, things we'd rather not believe in. But they're there, waiting in the shadows, lingering just beyond the edges of our perception. At Wolf Tells, we specialize in exploring these dark corners of existence, where the line between reality and the supernatural blurs. And as much as these stories might make your skin crawl, they're a reminder, there's always more to discover. Before you go, let me ask you this: do you think you'd be brave enough to face the things you've heard about tonight? Could you handle an encounter with a shadow that watches, a stalker that waits, or a delivery that takes you somewhere you might never return from? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Have you ever had an experience that made you question what's out there? And if you enjoyed tonight's stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells. By subscribing, you'll never miss a chance to explore the strange and the terrifying with us. For those of you who made it all the way to the end, we have even more chilling tales coming your way. Next time, we're diving deeper into stories of haunted roads and the mysterious creatures that roam them. You won't want to miss it. Stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, the shadows are never empty.